Hi folks, in this video I'm going to talk about the complicated relationships in the brothers Karamazov. It's not always easy to tell why characters are acting the way that they are, but if we're going to understand the philosophical significance of the novel, it's actually essential that we understand what their motivations are. For example, Dmitri is torn between his love or his relationship with two different women, Katerina and Grushenka, and in order to understand his fate, who he should end up with in the story, what is actually his existential position, what is the plight that he faces, we have to understand how he's pulled in different directions by each of these relationships. So let me talk about these two central female characters because they're really critical to understanding the story. Katerina, or she's often called Katya for short in the diminutive or familiar form, she is an upper class person. She is a wealthy woman, or she comes from a noble family. And she also thinks very highly of herself and her family. So she has internalized a lot of the honor that one has in these aristocratic times, the same sort of honor that really motivates Dmitri in certain ways, but it's her care for her family, so her father's name. And it might be difficult to figure this out at the beginning of the story, but she comes to Dmitri early on in the story. And the motivation there is, so Dmitri at this point is a scoundrel. He's an officer, but he's sort of a lower ranking officer in the Russian military. He throws his money around. He's sort of a playboy or something. Like he's a bit of a partier and a rogue. And she is indebted to him because he is going to save her. Her father, actually, who's a respected person, an officer in the military, has embezzled money, and it's about to come to light. And her whole family is going to be ruined. So she, in a sense, is sacrificing herself and throwing herself at Dmitri in order that he will give her the 5,000 rubles in order to save her father. And that's the pretense for her coming to visit him that night. In fact, Dmitri sort of moved. He has these impulses of nobility. Remember, it's really central to his character that he has a sense of honor, and that's why he berates himself so much, because he sees that he fails to live up to his own standards continually. But he has this act of nobility here and just gives her the money, in part because he's really put off by her pride and her attitude, and he's in some ways repulsed by her. But ironically, that kind of repulsion that he feels towards her eventually draws her in. So even though she doesn't have to sacrifice herself for Dmitri, it's given in a sense as a free gift, she then creates a narrative in her mind where she is deeply indebted to him and she must be his savior, his salvation. So later on, when he ends up in prison, because he owes money to all these people, he gambles his money away, famously just like Dostoevsky himself. Dmitri then ends up in prison, just like Dostoevsky himself. And she comes and bails him out under the pretenses of actually being his bride. So previously, Dmitri said that made something like an offer or a proposal of marriage, and she now is accepting it, even though he's not really showing signs of being in love with her and wanting to get married. But she now takes it that she is his betrothed, and she also is now wealthy. So because Dmitri saved them and their family wasn't disgraced, her father and her family then inherited some money, and now they're not destitute anymore. So ironically, now Dmitri has everything that he needs. He has the woman that he was attracted to. He has money because she's providing for him. But in certain ways, he's still tortured over this. There's something about this relationship that fundamentally doesn't work on a deeply personal, on an existential level for him. And so this is what I want you to think about. What is going on with this relationship? Why is this relationship not successful? What are Dmitri's motivations? Because it might seem just completely mysterious to people, I think. It's certainly mysterious to Fyodor. So in this one conversation, eventually Dmitri becomes enwrapped with Grushenka, and he is torn between both of these women. But Fyodor can't understand why Dmitri doesn't just go with Katerina, because from Fyodor's, Fyodor is just the completely selfish buffoon, and he's thinking, okay, she's got money. Why wouldn't that makes she's beautiful and rich? How it doesn't make possibly makes sense why he wouldn't marry her. Of course, Fyodor would just marry her in an instant. Ivan says this interesting line, he doesn't love her. Of course, this is telling because hopefully you can figure out that Ivan is deeply jealous of Dmitri. Ivan is the person who actually has feelings for Katerina. And so he, in a sense, perceives this. He's tuned into Dmitri's feelings. He sees Katerina looking at Dmitri, and so he's carefully studying Dmitri to see what his rival is going to do. And in some ways, it serves Ivan's interest that Dmitri isn't interested in Katerina, but is instead enwrapped with Grushenka. But this, I think there's a way to misread this, though. So this is the thing that I'm warning people about. Because you might say, he doesn't love her. So what this story is really about is true love, like in the Princess Bride sense, this kind of romantic ideal of love. And that's actually not the picture that this story is presenting. Love is absolutely central. That is the key theme to this entire novel. But it's not a kind of storybook, fairy tale, romantic kind of love. And I think it's easy to misunderstand Ivan's remarks. You might think the reason that Dmitri and Katerina's relationship is actually not working out is because it's not based on this true love like Wesley and Buttercup. That's not Dostoevsky's picture. So we need to keep thinking about it. Now, it is true that Dmitri later does fall in love with Grushenka, but remember this, because this is, I think, gives us some sense of the true love thing. It's not that now he's deeply in true love, and so he is meant to be with Grushenka. You'll see if you kept watching through the second part of the story, their relationship is tumultuous too, just like his relationship with Katerina. It falls apart and is on the rocks. He becomes incredibly possessive and really sort of creepy and is following her around and being incredibly controlling. So it's not like they have this fairy tale relationship, like this is true love in the Princess Bride sense. And that shows us that the novel is endorsing his relationship with Grushenka instead of Katerina. I think this shows that is not the picture that the novel is putting forward. They do have some sort of lustful passion. I think that's undeniably true. But that's not actually the full story either, as is manifest later on in the novel. So we need to keep thinking. But what I want you to think about is which of these women presents the existential pairing for Dmitri. That's one of the key questions. And how are these relationships going to be resolved? Because actually, there's several different triangles of folks who are in competition with each other, or there's these complicated webs of relationship, like Fyodor, Dmitri, and Grushenka. All three of them have this kind of triangle of affection and repulsion, and they're fighting. You know, Dmitri is constantly watching Fyodor. Dmitri is watching Grushenka to see how she is reacting to Fyodor, and vice versa. So all three of them are tangled up. And of course, Dmitri, Katerina, and Grushenka are all tangled up. And Ivan, Dmitri, and Katerina are tangled up. So there's many different trios of relationships where each of these groups is trying to work out what they're going to do with their lives. What is their deep character motivations? What is how their stories are going to get resolved, whether they can find an authentic or successful way to live in the world. So the contrast between Katerina and Grushenka is really essential, and it's just as important as the contrast between the various Karamazov characters. So in order to understand it, I'll just present how starkly drawn they're shown to be in the novel. The movie gets at this in several places, but the contrast is even more prominent in the novel. So Katerina is an upper class woman, and Grushenka is a lower class woman. So she is considered like a working class woman. As a young girl, she threw herself at the feet of the Polish officer who then spurned her. So now she has this image, the novel really portrays her as sort of an unmarried woman of a certain age. Even though she's young still, she hasn't been attached. And this is a sign of, great humiliation or potential humiliation in this very patriarchal and classist Russian society. So she is lower class, although she's not a complete serf. She's a businesswoman. So in interesting ways, she lacks social status. That's the big part of it. That's the big contrast. Katerina has all the social status. Grushenka has none. But in other ways, Grushenka has other kinds of currency. She's incredibly smart and savvy. So she's a very successful businesswoman, and she has meaningful relationships with the other tavern owners around town, with her clientele who seem to actually respect her. So in certain ways, she's presented with a lot of virtues. So both women, of course, are beautiful, but Grushenka has these other virtues too. She has independence. And this is, so her independence and her intelligence, I think, they're perhaps a little easy to miss in the movie, because the movie really doesn't get into as much of the characters' personal stories nearly as much as the novel. But there are ways in which, and I think it's very easy in movies, of course, where people are presented visually, it's very easy to get the sense that the movie is presenting her merely as the beautiful woman who the two men want her to marry them. Whereas it's not just her beauty that's driving her as an important character. It's actually the independence and intelligence she has, and the way in which she plays the men against each other in this competitive form. They are tools to her actions in many ways. This is really important to her character and what happens with the rest of her character. And in some ways, Katerina, this is an inversion, because you see, on one level, on the level of social status, Katerina has all the trump cards. She is the upper class person and Grushenka is the lower class person. But it's inverted in terms of their other qualities. So Katerina, she has this kind of pride, but it's pride to a fault. She is deeply self-involved, and she is not passionate about the world at all, whereas Grushenka is deeply passionate about her reactions to the world. There's actually this hilarious moment when the rivalry between these two women really becomes prominent. They have this scene in Katerina's parlor where Katerina is really trying to resolve this relationship between Grushenka and Dmitri so that Katerina can have Dmitri to herself, get Grushenka out of the picture. And really, Katerina is trying to manipulate Grushenka. And what you see is this sort of twist in the novel, in the story. Grushenka then sort of betrays her and humiliates her and says, "Oh, you kissed my hand 5 times. Actually, I think I'm not going to bother kissing yours in return," which is this big sort of slap in the face in this aristocratic culture where people are concerned with pride and honor and things like that. Especially to be insulted in such a way by a lower class person, but even to then not have her rival out of the picture. And Grushenka has this amusing line. So again, Grushenka turns out to be the master manipulator, the better. Katerina attempts to manipulate her and just completely fails. And so Katerina says, "You said it was only passion with you and Dmitri." And Grushenka says, "Oh, only passion," as if there's more to life. She says, "Only, dearest lady, you have to try it sometime." I think this is really, there's many places in the story where one character actually speaks the truth and says something deeply insightful about another character. And I think Grushenka here is saying the thing that cuts to the core of Katerina, that Katerina lacks passion in her life. And I think that's one of her major character flaws. So when Grushenka is portrayed as passionate, I think sometimes it's hard to read those scenes in the movie. They sort of seem silly, like when the band, there's a band of gypsies that plays in the tavern, and it's almost sort of foolish, and it's hard for us to understand exactly how the movie is portraying a message here. We're supposed to, I think, sympathize, and Grushenka's passion in those moments is held up as something laudable, not foolish or something to be laughed at. Okay, now just speaking in terms of characters talking the truth and saying insightful things, this again, it has to do with the relationship between Dmitri and Katerina. Alyosha now says the line that she loves you. This goes back to where Ivan is talking about Dmitri's lack of love. And in some ways, Alyosha is right. She does love Dmitri. The question I want you to think about, though, is what kind of love does she have for Dmitri, and what kind of love does Dostoevsky think is the redemptive kind, is the central kind that is Dostoevsky's vision of authentic living? Dmitri says something quite insightful here, where he says, "She loves her own vigil more." This, I think, is a deeply insightful line. In fact, earlier on, we saw her pay homage to her own vigil. This is the scene where, one of the many scenes where Ivan is talking with Katerina. This is one of the earliest one, actually. this is right when she arrives from the train. We see her lighting this little altar, and this is her lighting her own vigil. And she keeps asking these questions. She wants to talk about Dmitri. She sees Ivan as somebody worth talking to because he knew Dmitri when they were younger, and she wants to now, she has this idea in her head about who Dmitri is because Dmitri played this role in her life, and she has to then make all the facts somehow twist and form to her vision rather than her paying attention to the people around her and what they need. So she says to Ivan, like, tell me everything about Dmitri, everything. Like what he was like as a boy or a young man. I'm jealous of all these things that I don't know about him. And sort of Ivan tries to keep turning the conversation back to himself. He was like, Ivan says, well, you know, Dmitri didn't have a father. He was left there. He was kicked out, you know, when he was 4 years old. His mother died. And then he was raised by Grigory. And she says this like, oh, 4 years old, no father, no mother. Can you blame him for being wild and impulsive? Like she's spinning this narrative. She's using the facts that she's getting to build this narrative that she wants to believe, to create an image of her. That's what she's honoring. That's what Dmitri is in her mind. Ivan says like, oh, you know, actually Alexei and my mother died too, and we were raised quite young. And she just like doesn't even hear his comments about himself. And he sort of makes a point like, well, Alexei turned out to be quite saintly, so why is that an excuse for Dmitri being wild and impulsive? But again, that just is like, that washes over her. That just goes completely past her, like water off a duck's back. It doesn't bother her at all, because that doesn't fit her narrative, so she just ignores it. So the last thing I'll say about this is this concept of love, whether she loves Dmitri, whether her love is of the right kind, really does relate to the central theme of the story. So Alyosha has one of these moments of speaking the truth when he says earlier on, Dmitri, we all need love. This really is the Dostoevskian message. Love is going to be essential to the reconciliation of all of these relationships, whether they're successful or unsuccessful. It's all going to come down to the role of love. So this is going to be the Dostoevskian story. Notice this is a bit like Kierkegaard, because remember, I claimed that in The Princess Bride, Kierkegaard's conception of the most authentic way to live is through an unconditional commitment in romantic love. That's at least one example of it. But this is what I want you to pay attention to. What kind of love is Dostoevsky giving us? Is it like Kierkegaardian love, or is it something different? That's your job to try to figure out. Here's the broader context that line of dialogue comes from. Alexi says to Dmitri, how can you hate your own father? So he's commenting on this adversarial relationship between Dmitri and Fyodor. That's one of the center pieces of the whole plot of the story. Dmitri says this thing, he was never a real father to any of us. So what do you expect me to do, love him? This is really critical. So Fyodor did fail his children in a certain way. They did not have love in the right way from Fyodor. So how has Fyodor failed them, and what do people need instead that Fyodor did not do? That's one thing to think about. This is gonna continue to be an important idea. And it's in response to that Alexei, that Alyosha says, Dmitri, we all need love. He is right. The question is, what does that mean? What do we all need? This question about the relationship between fathers and their sons too, it's obviously the centerpiece of the Karamazov family struggle. But I hope you notice that it comes up again in another subtle way. There's another father and son pair in the story, and this subplot is meant to be a commentary on the other family relationships as well. So this man, Captain Snegurov, he is an employee of Grushenka, and he enters the story in a couple of different places. So his son, Ilyusha, don't confuse his name, Ilyusha, with Alyosha. So Alyosha is another form of Alexei. That's one of the Karamazovs. Ilyusha is the little boy who's the son of Snegurov, and this is the guy who Grushenka tells him to start buying up Dmitri's debts. This is part of the plan that Grushenka and Fyodor hatch. And he does, but then Dmitri gets word that some person, Snegurov, is buying up his debts, and he gets mad at him. He goes out and publicly humiliates him. And then this causes all sorts of trouble. And it puts into question the relationship between this father and this son. So we can see how this relationship works out to get a better, more holistic sense of what Dostoevsky thinks is the right sorts of relationships. So we need to keep track of this family just as much as the Karamazovs as the story keeps working its way out. Okay, now let me pose a question to you so you can try to see how much you figured out so far. Here's a bunch of characters. So here's 5 central male characters, and here's the 2 central female characters. I want you to rank these groups. So in terms of their levels of passion, how passionate are these people? And what does that tell us about them? So pause your videos now and see if you can figure out who's the most to least passionate. Okay, that was your chance to pause your videos. I'm going to launch into giving you my ranking. Basically, according to the male characters, I think Fyodor and Dmitri are both maybe tied as equally wild, impulsive, and passionate. They might be slightly passionate in slightly different ways. So Fyodor is just more basely sensual. He just is someone who has appetite, whether it's for food or women or drink or anything else. He's almost like an animalistic appetite kind of character. Dmitri is no less passionate, I think, but in different ways, because it's wrapped up with this fact that he has a moral center and this sense of honor and nobility, which he continually fails to live up to. Alyosha is an interesting character. In many ways, he is presented as saintly. This is especially emphasized in the movie, which I think is a shame. So his character is much more deep and multifaceted, multidimensional in the novel than actually comes across in the movie. But we'll talk about Alyosha's character in subsequent videos once you've done a few more bits of the reading, because we're going to see passages from the book which actually shows how much more complicated Alyosha or Alexei's character really is. So I think he actually ranks somewhere in the middle. In certain ways, he's too reserved to be as passionate as Fyodor and Dmitri. He never gets in these wild fits of enjoyment or partying like they do. But you might say, well, he has a kind of religious fervor and passion for the spirituality, and I think that's right. But we need to see more what happens to his character to really get a sense of him. Ivan and Smerdyakov, I think these are clearly the characters who in many ways are compared to each other, and they are far less passionate. So Ivan is the arch rationalist, the objective scientist, the atheist, who is very reserved. He can hardly even tell Katya how he feels. He keeps it all bottled up inside. He never acts impulsively. He's completely opposed to either Fyodor or Dmitri in many ways. And Smerdyakov is really presented as a kind of parody of Ivan. Smerdyakov, when Ivan arrives from the train earlier on in the story from Moscow, he's the intellectual from the big city who's had some education. Smerdyakov starts quoting Ivan's newspaper articles or pamphlet articles back to him. And Smerdyakov really models himself on Ivan's atheism as well. So I think these two characters are aligned in being much more distant and disengaged from reality. They are not dependent on others, and they are not that involved with others. I think that's really key to understanding them. Now, of course, you probably have already seen, since we talked about it before, Grushenka is obviously the passionate one, and Katya is the more reserved one. And this, I think, helps us understand a little bit Ivan's attraction to Katya. So one thing that I dislike about the movie is that when Katya arrives on the train, Ivan looks like he's completely smitten, like it's love at first sight. And now he's just motivated by this kind of romantic love for Katya. And again, I think it's easy for movies to give that impression because they're visual mediums. It's a visual medium, and we can easily just see his reaction to her physical appearance and think that that's what the relationship is all about. It's really not like that. I think at a deeper level, Ivan sees a lot of Katya as a kindred spirit. He's a person who's not deeply passionate either. He's way more reserved. She fits him so much more than she fits Dmitri. If only if only this relationship could work out, they could both end up happy. So what is going to happen? How is this complex web of relationships actually going to work its way out? Who's going to be successful or not? And what can we glean about Dostoevsky's conception of living authentically from it? These are all the questions you should be thinking about as you finish the rest of the story. Okay, thanks.